Hey, this is Thomas. Welcome to part 2 of this Lightning Boy Shader tutorial in which we go over the steps that I took to make this scene over here. So if you missed part 1, basically I went over how I made the characters, some modeling tips, but mostly how to use Lightning Boy Shader to shade these characters and how transparency works with this shader. And now we're about to start part 2 where I go over the environment. This is a question that we often get. By default, when you use Lightning Boy Shader, it's set up so that you can very easily use it for an outdoor scene. But if you want to make an indoor scene, you have to change a few things for the lights to work. So we're gonna go over this whole process right now. So here I have my 3 characters that I modeled previously. In my case, I wanted to model my characters first and then build the room around them. That way I have a better idea of the scale of the scene and it just helps me to know what I'm doing. And so in this case, I'm going to make some sort of hotel room, a bit like Luigi's Mansion. So I'm going to start by creating a cube and scaling up so that the room is bigger than my characters. And right away you can tell that my main key light is not hitting my characters anymore. That makes a lot of sense, of course. By default, the 3 lights that are created with the Lightning Boy Shader are sun lights. So that means that they start from an infinite distance and they will light through the entire scene. But now that there's a big cube surrounding my characters, the light cannot hit them anymore. So don't worry, we're gonna fix that. All right, so I'm adjusting the size of this room a little bit. And I already assigned the base Lightning Boy material to this room. And now we're going to start working with the lights. And here I'm going to select the background light. So some of you might be wondering, why do we even have like multiple lights? What is the difference between a character key light, a background key light, and an extra key light? And why do these 3 lights appear when we set up a basic Lightning Boy Shader scene? So to talk a bit more about this, let's have a look at some 2D animation and see how they are doing things. So this is a frame from Tekken King Crete, one of my favorite animated films of all time. Overall, you can tell they're taking a lot of liberties with the way the film looks. And if you look at the electric post on which this character is standing, you can tell that it's lit from the left and then the entire right side is completely in the shade. So technically, if this was a normal 3D scene, half of your character would be in the shade as well. But this is not the look that the creators wanted. So it kind of pops and you can see him really well in the picture. If you look at this other example here from Spirited Away, once again, the environment has a ton of details and a lot of shade as well, because we're in a forest, so you want it to feel like it's pretty dense and the light can't go through. But despite that, the main character here is almost fully lit, like she was in an outdoor scene and there was not a single tree to block the light. So this is obviously completely impossible in real life, but with 2D animation, it's something that you see all the time and it works really well. So this is exactly what you can do with the Lightning Boy Shader. You can use your background key light to light all of your environment and have a separate light, the character key light, that will give them this kind of shading. So once again, this is non-photorealistic. We're not trying to reproduce reality. We're trying to make a scene that's aesthetically pleasing and that will catch the eye of the audience. And of course, this is totally up to you. If you do want to use the same light for your characters in your environment and you want them to cast proper shadows and look like they're part of the environment, that's totally doable as well. Okay, so now that we know why we want to use a specific background key light, let's see how we adjust it so that it can work in our indoor environment. So the first thing you must do is make sure that the key light node in your shader is set to background key light. So you press the H button to reveal the options of your key light node, and you can change, if it's not done already, this little drop down menu from character to background. Now going back on the light again, by default it's set as a sunlight. So to change that, you need to click on this little light icon here, and here you can change the type of light into either point light, spotlight, or area light. In this case, I'm going to set it as a point light first. And there are a few extra settings inside this light option. You have a color here that's set to green and a power that's set to 1. Normally, we recommend that you should never touch any of these, especially the color. If you touch the color, it's gonna break how the Lightning Boy Shader is able to know which light is the background key light and which light is the character key light. So don't touch the colors. And the power, usually as long as you're using sunlights, it doesn't matter. So you shouldn't mess with the power either. But when we get inside this room here, by default at 1, this point light is not capable of lighting this room. So I need to increase the power until I can see my light affect the room. And it would be the same thing if I were to use a spotlight or an area light. So when you're working indoor, you do want to crank up the power of your lights. And now I'm gonna go into the Lightning Boy shader and start adjusting the color of the shadow area of my room, and then the color of the key light. So where the light hits, it's gonna be this kind of brighter blue. And I'm adjusting the range and softness a little bit. So next I'm gonna speed up a bit here, but basically I'm just modeling parts of the environment. And now I'm gonna actually create a hole for a window. And here I wanted to experiment with something, so I actually took my point light, turned it into a sunlight again, and took it outside of the window. Because I felt, oh yeah, that would be cool, like that would be a cool way to light the scene, to have kind of this light coming from outside. And then I'm modeling these little like wood pieces in the middle of the window so that they can cast nice shadows on the floor. Okay, so at this stage, I noticed that there is an issue with some of my lights. So I have this building, this room made of a cube, and I have a spotlight outside. And for some reason, the spotlight is kind of peeking through at near the ground, and it looks pretty bad. Like, we shouldn't catch these little highlights here. It makes no sense. So this is some sort of glitch. I'm guessing Blender has a hard time knowing this wall is so thin in reality, like it's just a cube, so it's not sure if the light should go through or not. So in a case like this, you most likely want to go into your light settings and start looking at the shadow options. There's a bunch of settings here that you can start tweaking, and you can also turn on contact shadows, and that's gonna most of the time make your light a bit more precise with its shadows. And you can once again tweak those values and see if you're fixing the issues you're having with your light. In my case, I could still see a bit of the light peeking through. So even with all of that, my light doesn't have enough information with just the thin wall to know that light shouldn't peek through. So what I tried instead is I created a cube and I placed it outside to see if it would work, and it instantly worked. It blocked all the light that was peeking through the wall, because now Blender could know that there's definitely something here blocking the light. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna need to add those little cube shapes outside of my scene to block the light and help Blender know, hey, there shouldn't be any light peeking through here. So I'm increasing the size of these cubes and I'm placing them around my scene like this. And then I'm going to create a new Lightning Boy shader material for them. So I can delete everything and just keep the color, and even the color I could technically probably remove it. But what's important is I go in the options of the material over here, like I showed in part 1, to make something transparent. And I set the blend mode to either alpha ash or alpha blend. And I keep the shadow mode to opaque. This is important because I want these cubes to cast shadow in this case. And now in the Lightning Boy shader options, I can actually turn off the transparency so that they're basically invisible, but these cubes are still casting shadow on my scene. Now going back to my main Lightning Boy shader material that I'm using for the entire environment, currently I have a base color and a key light, but I'm going to add a virtual point light. So with this virtual point light, the power is not affecting anything, as you can see here. So it's useless to kind of play with that. But if you go in the options of your node here, you can actually play with the max distance if you press tab to reveal more options in this node. And then I can place it kind of in the middle of the room. So my goal with this light is to make it look like the main light that's coming from the window is bouncing off the floor and lighting the walls near this area. But just so you know, a virtual point light will not cast shadows. So it's nice as some sort of secondary light, but it does have some limitations. Now, like I was saying before, right now my virtual point light is not creating any shadows. And so this scene is lacking a lot of details right now. For example, the curtains, they should be casting a shadow behind them so that the front of the curtain is brighter than behind, of course. So to fake that feeling, we're just going to add ambient occlusion. So here I'm going to add one more slot into my Lightning Boy shader main node, and I'm pressing Shift A to open the add menu, click on the Lightning Boy shader nodes, and I bring ambient occlusion SS. So now I can bring it in my scene and I can just adjust my settings until I get the look that I want. So here I can make sure that the color of the ambient occlusion is not full black, but a pretty dark blue. And now it really helps to feel all the little details of the room near the curtains and all that stuff. And remember, if you're adding ambient occlusion SS in your scene and it's not working, you have to click on that little camera icon for the render settings and make sure that ambient occlusion is turned on. You have to do this in every scene that you want to use ambient occlusion in. So now I can keep modeling more elements to my scene. As you might notice, I'm not like pushing the details near the window too much yet. I'd rather place all the key elements around the room and then add details once I figured out the blocking of the overall room. All right, so at this stage, I already have a few elements placed around my room. I have the little table, I have the windows. So I'm like, oh, might as well place my characters. And so here I'm going to take my character key light, as I described before, and now I'm going to turn it into a spotlight because I want it to be placed inside the room and to be able to light my characters. So if you remember, because I'm turning the sunlight into a spotlight, I do need to increase the power for it to affect my characters correctly. And now I'm really happy with this look because, like I said before, with this character key light, it's very bright, it's very strong, my characters pop, and yet it's not affecting the background in any ways. My characters are not casting shadows on the background, and the main light itself normally would like make this background overlit, but I want it to be dark and gloomy. So by having different set of lights, it's very easy to keep those things separate. Now I'm working a bit on the door in the background, just adding details and not much to say here. And next I'm going to work on the couch. Once again, add details into the room and the environment. So here I'm actually going back into my sunlight that was lighting through the window, and I'm changing it once again into a spotlight. So I keep going back and forth with this one because that's part of the fun for me, is experimenting and try to see different looks that I can get. So what I like with the spotlight is by playing with the power, remember, like that one value that allows me to crank it enough that you can see the light affect your environment. If you actually lower that power a little bit, you can adjust a little fade effect on how far your light is hitting the room. And so now if you look on the ground, there's this nice little gradient effect, which I thought was cooler than using sunlight. Now I'm gonna adjust something else in the Lightning Boy shader material. With this shader, there's a few nodes that can do similar-ish effects, and it can be interesting to test them out and see what works better in your situation. So I have the virtual point light, which is like this spherical light, if you will, and I wanted to see what happens if I use a spherical gradient instead. So here I'm bringing the spherical gradient and I'm adjusting the values to like keep it very faint, but I just wanted to feel like the light coming from the window is kind of affecting the area around it. And I was happy with that look, so I ended up keeping it. So this is kind of how I work in general. If I have a strong idea for the shader I want, I can just build it straight up. But if I'm not sure, I tend to model a bit, then tweak my shader, and then model some more, tweak the lights, model some more, tweak the shader again, until I find the look that I like. So next I'm going to add details on the pumpkin. So I need to dig holes for the eyes and for the mouth. And if you've seen part 1 of this tutorial, you'll know that I struggled finding a good way to dig holes for the Shy Guy mask. It was pretty tricky to have it to react well with lights, but I figured the solution and now I could apply it here. So as you can tell, I'm basically cutting the shapes with the cut tool, and then I make sure that there's a ring of geo along the hole, and then I can like extrude inside or cut the faces, and I know it'll look nice. Now another thing that I needed for this to look like a pumpkin is to have those little inward lines, let's say. So I selected a bunch of lines around the mesh, and then I used the proportional editing tool. So you can press O to access this, or click on the little icon at the top of the screen, and you can adjust how big the area of influence is. And then I just scaled inwards with those lines selected. And I was pretty happy with how it looked. It gave the little pumpkin feel I was looking for. So now I want to start adding different colors to my scene, and this can be a little bit tricky. So far, remember that we were using a single Lightning Boy Shader material for everything, so it was pretty straightforward. If I were to add Ambient Occlusion to my main material, it would appear everywhere on my scene. But if I have multiple versions of the shader applied to different objects, I would have to manually add Ambient Occlusion to each of them. So you can tell why I kept it with only one material so far. But now let's look here. Let's say I want my walls to be blue and my curtains to be red. Normally, I would duplicate the Lightning Boy Shader material that I did and do a red variation and apply that to the curtain. The problem though is the way the shader is built. I had to assign one color for the base color, which was a dark blue, one color for the ambient occlusion, which was another dark blue, one color for the key light, which was a brighter blue, and I would potentially have more nodes depending on my scene. So now when I duplicate this into the curtain one, I have to go change my base color to a dark red, my ambient occlusion to another dark red, my key light to another brighter red, and my spherical gradient for another brighter red. So it's going to be a lot of back and forth. And then let's say I want another material for my pumpkin. I have to redo all of this, but with orange colors. And let's say I want to do a table. I have to do everything else with a brown color and so on. So this process makes sense if you want a lot of different looks for your materials. Let's say you want the doorknob of a door to look metallic. It makes sense to have a custom Lightning Boy Shader material that has a matte cap or some other nodes that would make it look metallic and reflective. But in my case, I don't really care about all of that for my scene. All I want is different colors and everything can have roughly the same material look. So I came up with a new idea to streamline the process a little bit, and it was actually my first time trying it with the Lightning Boy Shader here, and it worked quite well, so I'm gonna show it to you right now. So I'm going to try to automate as much as possible within the same shader. So the first thing I did is I created a base texture that looks like this. And this has a lot of color information. So I can basically pick different colors using the UVs. And then I'm going to drive all the variations. So you remember how we need a brighter version of the same color for the key light and a brighter version of the same color for the spherical gradient. I'm going to drive all of that within the same shader, but it's going to be based off the same color that has been picked via the UVs. So if I apply this new texture in the base color, you can tell that the whole scene looks a bit weird now because by default, all of these objects have unfolded UVs. So they're trying to show this whole texture on the mesh. But what you can do is you click on any object you want and you shrink its UVs a lot so that it gets very small, like a single point. And then you can place that point, use your UVs as some sort of color picker. So if I pick up a dark blue, that's gonna be my base color. Then I can use a really useful node in the Lightning Boy Shader, which is called the adjustment layer. So I can bring my adjustment layer and take the base color and make it darker, more saturated, and plug that in. And then I can take the same texture, plug it into another adjustment node, and make this one brighter, and then plug that in the main Lightning Boy Shader node. And that way, if I move my UVs, it's gonna change both the base color and all the other colors like the key light, the occlusion, and all that stuff. So it was a nice little trick. It worked pretty well. And that's how I assigned the different colors to almost all the objects in this scene. Okay, next I'm gonna work on the little yellow eyes of like monsters peeking through the open door in the back of the scene. So this is gonna be really simple. I'm just gonna create a plane like this and give it the shape of an angry eye. And then I'm gonna create a Lightning Boy Shader material. This material is gonna be really simple. It's just gonna use a color. And I'm gonna increase the value higher than 1. I'm doing this because I want this eye to glow, but for the glow to work, I need to go in the rendering properties, which is this little camera icon here. And here you can see the bloom option. So you must check that on and you can adjust the values a little bit. So in my case, I had already turned bloom on when I was working on the moves earlier. And then I can just assign subdivision modifier on the eye and it looks pretty smooth. and then I can keep changing the shape until it looks like what I want. And then I just duplicate these eyes a couple times and look through my camera like to make sure that it looks nice. And I can duplicate them and give like different shapes to the eyes so they don't look like exactly like they're copy pasted everywhere. Next up, let's work on the flame that'll go inside the pumpkin. So I start by making a sphere like this, and using the proportional editing tool, I kind of drag it upwards to give it kind of a teardrop shape. And now I'm going to create a Lightning by Shader material. I'm going to make it orange as the default color. But then I add a 2D outline, which basically you can set a color that's going to be on the outside of your mesh, but you can invert it. And by inverting it like this, I can control the color of the core of this flame, basically. And I just make sure that both the inside and the outside colors have a value higher than 1. And so right away, it'll glow once again. Now, when I place it in the pumpkin like this, you can tell that you would want it to look like the pumpkin is being lit by this little flame. So I'm gonna add a spherical gradient to the Lightning by Shader that I'm applying on all my environment. So that includes the pumpkin, that includes the walls, that include everything. And then I can put my new spherical gradient node here, and I can place it, adjust the softness, and that way it kind of looks like subsurface scattering a little bit. Like it looks like it's being warm and lit from the inside. But I gotta be careful because if you remember, the spherical gradient cannot cast shadows. So if it peeks through the pumpkin and it lights the desk, then it kind of looks wrong. Technically, there should be a shadow underneath the pumpkin here, so that doesn't really look right. I can only do this technique if I keep the spherical gradient kind of inside the pumpkin. So next, we're going to use a really cool Lightning by Shader node that I don't think we've ever mentioned before, and it's the Z depth of the Lightning by Shader. So you can just plug it in, and effortlessly you can see your Z depth taking place. So you can adjust the start and end very easily. And then what I did is I used the color picker to pick kind of a blue similar to what is in my scene, make it a bit darker, and there you have it. Already I have my nice little depth. And also, don't be scared while you're working to kind of reorder some of your nodes. So in my case, I think I was making sure like, oh, what happens if occlusion comes after this Z depth? What happens if occlusion comes first? And you can just like keep reordering a bit your nodes to see what looks best for you. So one of the things missing right now is the window still shows the blue default sky color from the Lightning by Shader. So we need to put a little image right there. So I'm gonna create the plane and assign a texture that I made. And to be honest, I really rushed that texture. I'm not even really happy with how it looks, but it's fine. So I brought it in the scene, and I kind of realized that I did a mistake. The color of the sky is actually more greenish, and the color of the room and the light on the ground is more blue. So technically I could very well go back to Photoshop and adjust the color there. It's probably the smartest way to go about it. But here I was a bit lazy and I wanted to use the adjustment layer from the Lightning by Shader. So I just piped this texture in the adjustment layer and tweaked it in there because I wanted to see like how, if I could get away with it, just changing the color so that the blue matches a bit more the rest of the scene without even having to leave Blender. And it worked. And it's not the best image in the back out there, but it does the trick, and that was enough for me. All right, so I know that I was a bit all over the place when I was explaining how I made the shader for this environment. So let's go over it one last time, and so you can see kind of what I ended up with. The material I ended up creating is quite messy. I think that it could definitely be improved. I just kind of was winging it along as I was going, but it works, and maybe it'll give you ideas on how to make your own environment shaders. So let's have a look one by one at what's going on in the shader. All right, so now I deactivated everything from this main material shader for the environment. So here, everything starts with that color picker texture that I made, that I showed you before. And remember, every element has a color assigned via their UVs. This texture goes into a layer adjustment where I make it darker and is piped into a color, and it's the base color. Then the same texture goes into a layer adjustment that makes it brighter, and that gets piped into a virtual point light that looks like this. Then I add a spherical gradient, which helps smoothen a bit differently from the virtual point light. Then I have my main key light, which adds this really strong light on the ground. That's the one that comes from the window. Then I have a spherical gradient that is inverted, and it actually darkens the corner of this room here. Then I add the Z depth. This one is a bit subtle. The ambient occlusion is the MVP here, because look what happens when I turn that on. It's really what helps feel like everything is sitting in place. And finally, I have the spherical gradient that's just used for the little pumpkin in the corner here. So technically, I could make that on a separate material, like have a duplicate of this material just for the pumpkin, and it's the only one that has this spherical gradient. But in this case, it's fine. And I like to have the possibility to change something on the main shader, and it'll affect the pumpkin as well. So now this whole scene is pretty much done, but there's just one last thing I wanted to explain to you. So if you're used to working with the regular 3D pipeline, you're probably used to importing your characters as a reference. That's kind of common in 3D pipelines. What it does is you make your character in a specific scene, and that scene is referred into your actual 3D animation scene. But in this scene, you can animate your characters, but you cannot tweak them. You cannot affect their mesh, change their geo. You cannot delete a part or mess with the material by accident. So that's very common in 3D, and that's a common question we also get by people that are using the Lightning Boy shader is, oh, when I try to append my character in the scene or use it as a reference, it doesn't work really well. And that's indeed the case. The strength of the Lightning Boy shader is a bit like I was explaining at the very beginning of the video, is you can kind of cheat with your lights a lot, and you can affect how your character is lit and cheat all of those colors live within your scene. That's how we designed the Lightning Boy shader to work, and that's how we prefer to use it. But for that to work, your character needs to be actually in your scene. So we always either copy the character and paste it, or open a new scene that has the characters in them or something. So that way, yes, the scene is actually a bit heavier to deal with, but if I click on my character, I can easily change his shading, tweak a backlight, change the color of my character or their transparency within the shot, and really have full control over how the character will look in the environment. So we know this is not really conventional, but this is the only way that we found so far that you can actually tweak your material on your character within your scene. All right, so that was it for this little tutorial about how to make this boo scene. This time I went quite in detail, so hopefully that will help a lot of you that are beginners and are not sure how to use this shader, or maybe not sure how to use Blender either. As always, thank you so much for supporting us and watching our videos. We really appreciate it. And stay tuned for more tutorials in the future. Take care.